Okay, so I'm going to introduce Alexia Kannas, Dr. Alexia Kannas from RMIT University in Melbourne. So she's going to talk to you about, as I said, Australian landscape really, and how that becomes a kind of malevolent force really in Australian cinema. So without further ado, over to you, Alexia.
Thanks, Russ. And thanks to the festival for having me. I've been having a great time here. I've been here for a week. Unfortunately, I have to go back on Sunday, but it's been fantastic and great to see you all here as well. So, my talk is on my phone and it's going dead. Okay. So my talk is going to focus or kind of tap into the festival's focus on eco-horror, yeah? That Russ has already spoken a little bit about. And in particular, I'll be looking at some of the reasons that the Australian landscape is a really important part of Australian horror cinema. I'm not going to look at so much of the industrial kind of context for genre films because, fortunately, you can watch a film about this, yeah, on Saturday. So they're actually screening the film Not Quite Hollywood, so you can learn all about Australian genre films from people like Quentin Tarantino. And we're also screening Long Weekend at the festival, which is an Australian film, eco-horror film, yeah? So you're going to have examples of these things. So what I'm going to concentrate more on is this question of why, or how we get to the point that the Australian landscape becomes such an important part of these films. How we get to the point where we have this idea of this monstrous landscape that is really more like a character than just a setting, yeah, in these films. So, cool. I thought I'd start with a map of Australia, which I'm sure you've all seen the shape of Australia before, but what's really fascinating about this map is it actually points out the people per square metre, yeah, that live in Australia. So the first thing that you can see is that it's the outer regions that are heavily populated, yeah? So we all live in the outer regions, basically. I live right down the bottom in that really orange bit in a place called Melbourne. But you can see that in most of the country, actually, and these statistics were 2016, in most of the country, you have less than 0.1 of a person per square kilometre, right? So it's a lot of empty space. This is the thing that this map is really good for pointing out, a lot of empty space. And this is the kind of space that you see in films again and again in Australian horror films. There's two ways of referring to the kinds of space that turn up in Australian horror films, or two types of space, I should say. The first is what we call the bush, and so I'm just going to define these terms, so when I use them, they make sense. The first is what we call the bush. The bush is something like the countryside, I suppose, yeah? It's kind of a vegetation usually, although the vegetation can be different kinds of vegetation, so it can be close to the beach or it can look like a forest. It's a little bit sort of flexible in this way, but it can also mean the areas that are just outside of the city. And this is kind of important, this distinction, right? That you've got the city and then you've got these other places, yeah? It sets up this kind of binary that's very, very important to what happens in Australian horror cinema. So any kind of populated area that exists outside of major metropolitan areas that looks different from a major metropolitan area as well. And so the idea of the bush is, so anything that's like a country version of something, we say it's a bush something. So if you play cricket, the sport, in the countryside, it's bush cricket. Or if you go to a dance party, like they have these dance parties out in the bush, they're called bush doofs. It's like doof doof, so you go to the bush doof, right? So it's also it describes, you know, this a whole approach, a way of kind of living, I suppose, as well. Now, the outback is something a little bit different. The outback is what's a lot more remote and a lot more vast, and you see pictures of the outback quite often in like tourism ads and things like this, yeah? The outback is different to the bush because it's characterised by it's very sparsely populated, very low density population, yeah? So the whole idea of the outback is that it's this kind of unspoilt, completely intact kind of natural place, yeah? It has some farming in some places, but it's very, very low impact farming. So we're talking about just some cows like walking around, right? So none of this kind of machinery or anything like that. And that's usually what people mean when they refer to this idea of the outback, okay? So you have the bush and the outback. So if you see Long Weekend tomorrow, you'll see more of the bush and the beach, right, than the outback. But I'll show you some examples of both. So both these types of the landscape, the outback and the bush, are really deeply ingrained in this idea of what Australia is. And this is true both for Australians themselves, so for us, as well as for the outside world, yeah? When people think of the Australian landscape, this is often what they think of. Whereas actually where I live, it just looks like it looks a bit like Paris, a little bit like an American city. It doesn't look anything like the things that are represented in these films usually, yeah? What's really important about this, or what demonstrates the importance of these spaces in Australia is the tourism, right? The tourism statistics. They're a huge part of the tourist industry in Australia. So in 2016, the Northern Territory alone, so the Northern Territory is, I mean, it's probably obvious in some ways, it's the northern part of the outback, yeah? So not so much the populated part, but the paler yellow. Represented like a huge portion of tourism to Australia. So I think I saw a figure that it made like over $988 million in the one financial year. Yeah, so it's a very important part of our tourism industry. So it's an image that we kind of like to sell, yeah, or that the government likes to sell. I'm going to show you an example of how this is done because it's very interesting the way that these ads draw on the landscape. I'm going to show you an ad that was commissioned by the Australian Tourism Board, and it's made by Baz Luhrmann. Do we know who Baz Luhrmann is, the director, Baz Luhrmann? Yeah, this is the only time I'm going to show a Baz Luhrmann thing ever, okay? He made this in 2008, and it coincided with the same when he made the film Australia. So he made this big film with Nicole Kidman and Hugh Jackman, and they also made these series of ads that go alongside it. And you can see that they're the same style. They've got this very, like, Baz Luhrmann, this is very romantic, yeah? Anyway, I'll play it, and then we can talk about it afterwards.
Look, I just think we need a break. I gotta go.
Oh, no, I said not on the front page. There's no footer on the front page. It'll have to be done again. Yes, all of it. Well, it doesn't matter how late, I'll be up.
Hey, it's me.
Sorry I haven't called earlier.
Busy day?
Hasn't ended yet.
It's never gonna change, is
Can
it?
we please not have this argument now?
It's always work.
What do you say?
You're not the same person I fell in love with.
Sometimes we have to get lost to find ourselves. Sometimes we gotta go walk about.
Okay, so this campaign, and they made one for Shanghai as well, so there's like different versions of it. It's very interesting to me as an Australian and as a film or media scholar as well, actually, yeah. You can see very obviously that it foregrounds the very like mysterious nature of Australian culture and of the landscape in particular. So what you have here is an executive, she's overworked, her relationship's falling apart, she's meant to be American, but she's really an Australian sitcom actor. And she's, you know, like, what is she going to do? Her life's falling apart. And then, fortunately, a magical Aboriginal child turns up and gives her some dust. And then everything's okay, because she wakes up in the middle of the outback and she disappears into this magical space called the outback. She finds herself in water. She's literally reborn. She comes up through the water, right? And what it does is it makes this place into this incredible sort of transformative magical space, yeah? Which is very good for tourism, right? Everyone wants to have that. If you're feeling a bit stressed or tired, just go for a walkabout, just go for a wander through the Australian landscape. So it's interesting to me that she disappears into the landscape at some point, but she reappears, yeah? And when she reappears, she is more herself than she's ever been. It's like this kind of, she goes inside and she left as an executive, she came back as Kate or whatever, right? This is very interesting to me, particularly as a genre film scholar, because it's so romantic, yeah? It's such a romantic idea. Okay, I'm going to show you something that contrasts with this. What I think is really interesting about many Australian genre films, and particularly horror films, in terms of the things that I've kind of set up here, is how this sense of mystery and wonder that's really obvious in this ad is transformed into a kind of very palpable threat. It becomes threatening in these contexts, yeah, in the genre context. This is what's very interesting. It becomes a kind of monstrous landscape in the horror film, and it's all about sort of malevolence, and it's all about danger. And there's kind of there's also a trope where nature itself starts to kind of take revenge on the people that are kind of trespassing into this space. And this attitude to Australia and to its landscape is what you get in a film like Ted Kotcheff's Wake in Fright, which is a 1971 film. And this film is about a young urban school teacher who finds himself stuck in this strange town called the Yabba. He's like on the way to a job. He gets stuck in this town, and what happens to him there is that he just kind of falls into this like downward spiral of like complete like moral degradation, basically, yeah, just because he's there in this space. Right? I'm going to show you a teaser trailer for this film. So in the teaser trailer, it's actually called Outback. So they very shortly after they did the teaser trailer, they changed the name of the film to Wake in Fright. But if you listen to the voiceover narration, you'll see how it's kind of the diametric, it's the same landscape or similar, and the diametric opposite kind of idea about what the landscape represents, okay?
In northern Australia, there are 5,000 square miles of sand, scrub, and searing heat. A desolate, primitive place that can take a man and destroy him. They call it the Outback, rated R.
Okay, so it's this like, it's literally a desperate, primitive place that's just sand, right? Not necessarily the place where you're going to have this transformative experience and your relationship is magically going to be fixed, right? So this film, I mean, this film does it better than, you know, this is like the pinnacle for me for Australian cinema. But it wasn't a very popular film at the time. It was critically popular, so it got very good reviews, but it was not popular with the movie-going public, so it didn't make much money, and it kind of disappeared for many years, yeah? So even though it's kind of thought of as a sort of a cult classic, cult/art house classic of Australian cinema now, it didn't actually have that kind of impact on all the kinds of films that were to be made in that period shortly afterwards. But there is a film that did have this kind of impact in 1975. I don't know if anyone's seen this, but this is Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, yeah? And this is really the film that kind of popularised the idea of the monstrous Australian landscape, or the potential for the monstrous Australian landscape. In particular, a kind of sense of anxiety about the landscape, yeah, a sense of not knowing, like the fact that you can't tell what's going on with this place. You can't read the signs to work out what's happening, yeah. So this film was adapted from a book, a 1967 book by Joan Lindsay, and it had the same name, Picnic at Hanging Rock. And what's interesting about that book and what the author did was that she never, she was on purpose ambiguous about whether it was a true story or not, right? So lots of people in interviews asked her if this had actually happened, what happens in the film that I'll explain in a minute, and she says she didn't answer the question, basically. What does happen in the film is that there's a group of schoolgirls who go out on a picnic. After all, it's called Picnic at Hanging Rock. But the year is 1900, and they're schoolgirls. It's Valentine's Day, and they get taken out by their school for a picnic, and 4 of them go wandering into this kind of rock formation that is Hanging Rock, and a bunch of them never come back. They're never seen again. So because the author didn't answer this question, whether this is a true story or not, there is this whole myth that starts to build up around the film, like this is a true story, yeah? And this is quite interesting, I think. one of the reasons it's interesting is because if you go to Hanging Rock, Hanging Rock's actually in Victoria, the state that I live in, and if you go there, there's all these signs you can see about where the girls were sitting and where they went, and you can follow their path as if it actually happened in real life, but it didn't. And it's like a thing for people to go there and call out the names of the girls. It's quite creepy, actually. It's an amazing place, though. But so there's this kind of myth about it, you know, about this thing actually being possible, that this place is, you know, quite somehow mysterious and magical and evil somehow, yeah? And so this is still happening when the film comes out, so a lot of people think the film is almost like a, you know, not a documentary, but it's like a tale of a true story, but it absolutely isn't. Vincent Canby, who was the New York Times critic at the time, called this an Australian horror romance. So it's not a straight horror film. It's very, very far in tone from the stuff you just saw with Russ. There's no nipple biting here, which is probably a good thing. I don't know how much more I can tell you, how many more nipples I can see bitten in one day. It's got this kind of romantic kind of art house quality, yeah, but it still does these horror tropes, and it was a very, very popular film. And so you get the same kind of thing happening in Australia, but on a much smaller scale, in the sense that people start making a lot of films that do similar things, yeah. Roger Ebert actually kind of hit the nail on the head for me in his review. He said that the film employs two hallmarks of modern Australian films. The first thing is beautiful cinematography, and I think you can see this when you see Long Weekend tomorrow as well, yeah? There's really interesting cinematography in that film. And the other thing is stories about the chasm between settlers from Europe and the mysteries of their ancient new home, yeah? And this is the trope that gets picked up on again and again. It's this idea of Europeans coming into this strange, mysterious space and not being able to understand how to deal with it because they don't have, because it's unfamiliar to them. It's like an alien space, yeah? Okay. So, Picnic at Hanging Rock didn't kind of come from nowhere. It's actually part of this idea or this style of the Australian Gothic. We have this specific kind of branch of the Gothic, right? It's quite different to what you think of when you think of like Edgar Allan Poe Gothic, for instance. So I'll just give you a little bit of context for this, right? Our country is, well, colonisation didn't happen that long ago in Australia. I'm not sure how much you know about Australian history. But British ships turned up, so the first fleet turns up in 1788, and we were established as a penal colony. So we were convicts, we came from convicts. So people who were badly behaved got sent to this crazy alien place on the other side of the world, and this was how white Australia was established. The first free settlers arrived in 1793, so they were the first people who were just moving for the fun of it, although it wasn't very fun conditions at this time. And the first time that anyone kind of went all the way around the country to see how big the country was, the first time it was circumnavigated was in 1801, 1802. But of course, the people that arrived, you know, in 1788 didn't know at the time, but there had been people living there for over 40,000 years. And in fact, there's some evidence that it's 60,000 years, yeah? So this is where the tension starts to happen, right? It's an inhabited place, but it was treated as if it wasn't. So at the same time that all this stuff's happening, Australia is like being born, Australia as we know it, white Australia. The Gothic novel becomes really popular in Britain. It starts to emerge as an actual genre, yeah? So this has a big effect on the kinds of stories that people write when they come to this strange place. So the English settlers come and, you know, they bring people who write, and they write short stories about this crazy, mysterious place in the style that's popular in Britain at the time, which is the Gothic novel. And you also get this really kind of interesting thing that happens where people become a little bit obsessed with Australia as an exotic kind of thing or place or culture at this time. And so you have, as I say up here, you have naturalists and amateur archaeologists and amateur historians who start to kind of collect bits and pieces from Australia that become kind of things that you will have in your house, or you have like an amateur collection of exotic sticks and like bits, you know, like Aboriginal tools and all these kinds of and Aboriginal art in your home. So they become kind of fascinated with this newly discovered land, and it's increasingly, as they find out more and more, they're realising it's a very ancient culture. So all the things start becoming kind of collectible. It's like they're doing this historical like work. They're like the first historians, yeah? And this really ties into that very romantic idea that a lot of cultures all over the world have had of discovering a lost civilization. Yeah, this is kind of what they thought was happening. They thought they'd discovered this lost civilization when they turned up in Australia. And it kind of informs a new fascination with Australian Aboriginal people as this timeless kind of culture. Yeah, this sort of lost in time people. Yeah. On the other hand, that all sounds really magical and special, yeah? But this sort of utopian and very idyllic idea of the bush and the outback was really in contrast to what people experienced when they got there. And there's lots and lots of accounts of how difficult it was and how strange it was and how isolating it was, yeah? So the early explorer John Stewart described Australia as a place where the rocky hills resembled old castles and ruins. So we didn't actually have castles like in Gothic novels. We didn't have haunted houses, but we had these weird rocks that had been there for 60,000 or millions of years that looked like the ruins of castles. Yeah, so this is where the Gothic started to come from. And you have Captain Charles Stewart who described, and this bit's really great, the absolute loneliness of the desert, the stillness of the forest, and he's talking about the bush there, yeah? The melancholy howl of wandering native dogs. So what you're confronted with here, as you can see a little bit in this image, even though it looks all golden and warm and the Australian Tourism Board would have you think that this is something that's going to change your life when you step into it, and it might, but what these people were confronted with was basically vast open spaces. Yeah, lots of horizontal plains, cloudless skies, and this just goes on forever and ever and ever, as you saw with that map before. Yeah, there is this general kind of sense that when you see this, you're confronting a void. There's no end to it. You can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's just the same all the way around. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit from Picnic at Hanging Rock, and I'm going to show you the moment that the girls actually disappear. Okay, and you'll see the way that the film treats the landscape and the rock formation itself. It's romanticized and very, very mysterious. It's kind of something between the tourism ad and what you get with more kind of genre exploitation cinema a little bit later on.
Irma! Look at them! Where in the world are they going? Without their shoes! Irma, wait! Wait for me! Please wait! Wait, Irma, wait!
Whatever can those people be doing down there? Like a lot of ants. Surprising number of human beings are without purpose, though it is probable they are performing some function unknown to themselves. Everything begins and ends at exactly the right time and place. Look.
really awful. Oh. Miranda, I feel perfectly awful. When are we going home? When are we going home? Miranda? Miranda? Miranda! Miranda, don't go up there! Come back!
Okay, and they were never seen again. So this is what people like scream out when they go to Hanging Rock. Miranda! It's a bit of a cult thing to do, but it's interesting because it kind of rewrites the history of the place, right? Now this place is the place where the white schoolgirls in 1900 on Valentine's Day disappeared, yeah? But actually Hanging Rock before that was a very important site for Indigenous Aboriginal people. This is an etching that was done sometime in the 1850s by a zoologist, a German zoologist, William Blandowski. That really kind of captures the same sort of mysterious kind of nature of the space, yeah, I think. And what was really interesting about this place is that it's believed that it was actually a very important meeting place between different tribes. So there was a lot of Indigenous people around in this space, but through the process of colonisation, a lot of them died of introduced diseases, which is what happened when Europeans came over to Australia, because people in Australia weren't used to all the same bugs, so a lot of people caught diseases and died, and then a lot of people were moved on as well, so they were kind of relocated to another town. So it has this mysterious emptiness, but it has this kind of history that kind of disappears a little bit as well. There's currently this campaign, it's something like a hashtag, like drop, like forget Miranda or something. It's like a pro, land, Aboriginal land right movement. I don't know about the hashtag, but because the film's really good, but anyway, it sets up these kinds of tropes of the Australian Gothic, which are then kind of pulled into the horror genre films that Australia makes after this point, yeah? So tropes like narratives of entrapment in this kind of hostile environment, yeah? This idea of being completely isolated in the middle of nowhere, and this sort of fear of the unknown, of this kind of landscape. You don't know what it's going to do or what's going to happen because you don't understand it. It's not familiar. So sometimes Australian horror films incorporate this idea of the Indigenous history, and sometimes they don't. In this film, for instance, it's kind of a very palpable kind of absence, yeah? There is something weird about this place that comes from an ancient time and culture, but it's never spelled out, yeah? Okay, so contemporary films that kind of pull this tradition through. Some of you may have seen Wolf Creek. It was a very successful Australian film by McLean in 2005, which is interesting because it's kind of like a slasher movie, right? And it has those conventions that we all know. It has this kind of perpetrator who's chasing all these victims and they're constantly trying to escape. But what's interesting to me in this film is, and to a lot of people with this film, is the Australian landscape setting, and how that kind of exacerbates the threat, yeah? So the characters, they're backpackers, always often foreigners, yeah, coming into this kind of natural space because they want to see this, kind of magical place, Wolf Creek. And this crazy, murderer, villain, starts to pursue them. But of course, what happens is that every time they try to run away, there's nowhere to run because this is what the space is like. If you're in the middle of Australia, there's nowhere you can go that's safe because it's this void, yeah, that you're confronted with. So that's kind of, in this way, in this film, the landscape becomes a real character, and in fact, it's almost more menacing than the actual villain, yeah? The other poster is from a film called Lake Mungo, which deals with it a little bit differently, but because the landscape in this film is kind of supernatural, so within the film it has a supernatural kind of force. So this film, you can actually see how it tries to draw a little bit in that kind of very genre way on Twin Peaks, because her name is Alice Palmer, not Laura Palmer, and she goes missing. So it's a little bit of that kind of David Lynch connection. But this young girl has this kind of experience or supernatural encounter that's quite horrific, and it's at this dried up lake called Lake Mungo, and the site is actually an ancient Aboriginal burial site, yeah? So you can see how there's a lot of these films have the name of the place in the film title, which is actually quite significant, yeah? So it's the place is kind of really foregrounded as important to the horror. Okay. The other thing that happens when you have monstrous landscapes is that you have all these monstrous things that go, like that, you know, that live in the landscape, right? So there is a big tradition in Australian horror films of like a killer, all kinds of strange animals, yeah? So I've chosen, I think this is actually a good choice now, considering, you know, we've been talking about Jaws a little bit. Jaws kind of just keeps coming back every so often. But in 2007, we had 2 killer crocodile movies, yeah? So this one, Blackwater, and the next one is Rogue, yeah? And in both of these, the crocodile or the killer crocodile kind of emerges in response to something that's happening to the land. And often, in both cases, in some ways, it's tourism, yeah? So in, oh, sorry, wrong button. So the killer crocs are kind of, it's like a revenge film, but it's the crocodiles that come for revenge, right? And you can see how they're doing exactly what Russ was describing Italian cinema doing. They're drawing on the connotations or the poster art for Jaws, right? I don't know if you've seen that very famous poster with the water and the sharks coming up from the bottom and the legs are like dangling all the time. This was a very influential poster design that films even, you know, in 2007 and forever will draw on, yeah? That one in particular looks a lot like Jaws. Okay. Before I move on, the Rogue is particularly interesting in the sense that the killer crocodile is a guardian of indigenous land. So in the other film in Blackwater, the crocodile is kind of only responding to the fact that crocodiles have become like a tourist attraction. So this big killer kind of crocodile comes to kind of seek revenge. And in this film, the giant crocodile is actually like a guardian of indigenous land. So if you want to see, if you're interested in this kind of idea of animals kind of going crazy, you really have to see Long Weekend tomorrow, because it's not a killer crocodile or a bird, it's the entire ecosystem turning against these 2 people who go to the beach for the long weekend, yeah? So make sure you catch that. And it does that thing that Roger Ebert was talking about, whereas there's that kind of, that tension between urban and rural, and that idea that nature is trying to sort of fight back, but it's shot really beautifully. There's some really, really interesting cinematography in it, so it's well worth seeing. Okay, so one thing that's interesting, or one thing that's kind of important for these genre films to do, is to use have a sense of realism. So the storyline might not be realistic, yeah? But the way that the landscape is shot in a lot of these films is realistic, and that is because it has to attract through this kind of idea that this is what Australia really looks like, and this is how dangerous the landscape really, really is. And it's quite interesting and sometimes kind of problematic, yeah, because there are a lot of other ways to represent the landscape that don't happen because Australia doesn't make heaps of films each year, and they need to make films that will sell overseas, and this is the kind of landscape that sells overseas. So you get these kinds of, you know, lots of shots of the outback, lots of shots of the bush all the time, yeah, in realistic or kind of heightened for mystery, but sort of generally realistic way. But there's actually other ways of representing the space, as I said, and I wanted to show you a kind of a clip to finish on from an Aboriginal artist named Tracy Moffat. I'm not sure if anyone's ever seen any of her films. So she's a photographer, but she also makes video art. Should change the slide now. So she's an Aboriginal artist. She primarily uses photography, but also video, and she draws a lot of inspiration from genre film. And for me, this is really, really interesting. She's an Australian filmmaker who's a genre fan, and so the way that genre works in this beautiful kind of way, where her love of genre starts to inform the way the landscape looks in her films. Yeah. She made this incredible film called, a short film, it's about 18 minutes long, called Night Cries, A Rural Tragedy in 1989, I've been talking about, as a series of kind of hyper-stylized vignettes. So it doesn't look realistic, it looks very theatrical, yeah? And it's kind of a proposed sequel to an Australian film called Jeddah, Jeddah the Uncivilized, from 1955, which was about an Aboriginal child who was taken or adopted by a white woman. This is a very famous film in Australia, Jeddah, and what happens in the end of the film, this is a bit of a spoiler, but you need to know for what I'm trying to say, is that the Aboriginal child falls off a cliff and dies, okay? So what Tracy Moffat does with this film is that she's trying to imagine what it would have been like if that child didn't die at the end of the film. It's a kind of an experimental sequel, right? So what happens is the Aboriginal child grows up and she's got her adopted white mother and she's living in this kind of, in the outback, in this kind of strange relationship where it's her mother but it's not her mother. It's a very tense and very kind of sad film. But what it does with the landscape, this kind of theatrical landscape, is really interesting because it kind of epitomizes that tension between the European colonizers and the Aboriginal people. This tension sort of manifests in the landscape. So it draws on Aboriginal Dreamtime kind of imagery, as well as European interpretations of the landscape to arrive at this very hybrid kind of aesthetic, yeah? It's hybrid and it's kind of nightmarish, but it also draws on films that, as a cult film fan, you would know and love, yeah? So there's actually a number of references to Dario Argento's film, Suspiria, in this short film, which I think is really, really interesting. And you can probably tell from the way that it's lit. There's lots of kind of Bava, sort of Mario Bava moments in here. I'll show you a clip from this film. So it's well worth seeing this film if you can find access to it. There's only like half of it on YouTube, so it can be a little bit hard to see, but it's very, very interesting in the sense that it is doing something so completely different from what the popular mainstream films are doing with the landscape, yeah? And I think what it kind of points to is, it kind of echoes what Russ was saying, and that is that there's very implicitly political stuff happening in genre films and in films that engage with genre, yeah? And in an Australian case, it happens to be around that kind of sense of space, yeah? So I hope you go and see Long Weekend tomorrow, and I hope you also see the Not Quite Hollywood exploitation documentary, which will kind of give you a whole kind of background on how genre films kind of exploded in Australia and why we didn't know about them as Australians until Tarantino told us about them, as he does, educating the world time and time again. But thank you very much.